It's time to get your music radio ready with the Audio Skills Podcast. It doesn't matter what type of music you're creating or what gear you use. It's all about the technique. Get ready to turn your home studio into a place where your music goes platinum. Now give it up for your host, Scott Hawksworth.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? Scott here with you for this latest episode of the Audio Skills Podcast. Before getting into today's show, I wanted to give a huge thank you to everyone for listening. We are closing in on 15,000 downloads all time, and that is just incredible and simply wouldn't be possible without your support. If you like this show and you like what we do here, then I'd really appreciate if you could go to iTunes and please rate it and review it. We've got a bunch of downloads, as I mentioned, but currently only 11 reviews of the show, partly because I haven't asked you guys for them. So if you could help me out by giving a rating and a review, that would be really huge in helping our show continue to grow. So thanks again so much, guys. All right, so now let's jump into our show for today. I'm really excited about what we've got for you today because this show is going to be all about compression and giving you some tips and advice on that. Compression is one of those things that can really make or break a project, so I wanted to dedicate a whole show to it. Joining me to help demystify compression will be Jason Moss, who is a fantastic mixing engineer and founder of BehindTheSpeakers.com. Before we chat with Jason, though, it's time for yet another audio tip of the week. As always, this tip of the week is my way of giving podcast listeners actionable takeaways. Just like people who are members of the Audio Skills site, read my articles, or watch our YouTube videos, I want you to get new skills. My audio tip for this week is about using compression in series, and more specifically doing it for vocals. Now, we've talked about using parallel compression before, having a compressed signal and an uncompressed signal in parallel that you would blend together. But another thing that you can do, something which was actually pioneered more by mastering engineers, is to use multiple compressors in a series or in a chain, which is called serial compression. So instead of trying to get 10 dB of gain reduction from one compressor, using two compressors each with 5 dB of gain reduction to total up to 10. This can get you smoother results and help you avoid choking the life out of a track with a compressor by kind of spreading the compression across multiple compressors. Now, you can also use two compressors in series on vocals for better results. For example, for the first compressor in the series, give it pretty light settings, maybe between 1 and 4 dB of compression with a fast attack. Now, this is designed to just control the peaks of the vocal a bit. Then you can add a second compressor next in the chain with a slower attack and maybe a little heavier compression or to your taste to really shape the tone of the vocal. And again, this is just something that you can do to try to, be a little more lighter with your compression and have a little more control over the compression and make it smoother and not so jarring, which is the thing that can really make compression sound not ideal, to put it one way. So try it out and see if you like what it's doing to your vocal. If not, hey, at least you have something else there in the bag of tricks should you want to use it someday. That is your audio tip of the week. All right, so now we're going to move on to our main interview and topic for this week. I am so thrilled to introduce our guest, who is going to help shed some more light on compression. Jason Moss is a professional mixer whose clients have included Disney, Sony, Glassnote, and many, many independent artists. He's a graduate of NYU's Clive Davis Institute of Recorded Music and frequently goes back to lecture on mixing there. And he's written how-to articles featured on Sonic Scoop, Berkeley, TuneCore, and many other places. And most notably, he's the founder of BehindTheSpeakers.com, which helps people take their mixes from good to great. So, Jason, what's up, man? How you doing?
Hey, Scott, that was great. So thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
For sure, for sure. How are things going in your summer so far?
Everything is good. You know, I don't spend as much time outside as I probably should, as I'm sure many of us probably don't.
Oh, sure.
It's beautiful here in sunny California, so everything is well.
I'm actually getting ready to go on a vacation where it's not looking so sunny. I'm going to the United Kingdom, so there'll be lots of rain. But hey, I mean, I expect that, right?
Yeah,
Not so much if I was going to California.
Yeah, well, hey, I hope you have a good time.
Thank you. So, okay, to start us off, can you just tell us a little bit more about your experience with mixing and, you know, what you're doing over at Behind the Speakers?
Sure. So my journey into mixing really started, like most people, you know, as a musician and a singer-songwriter. Mm-hmm. You know, when I was in high school, I was playing shows and you know, recording my own music. And my first studio was basically built from an old HP computer that I pulled out of my neighbor's garage can.
Wow, I love that.
Oh yeah, it could only do 2 tracks. You really had to make decisions very quickly.
Sure.
But it was a great start. So I was lucky enough to attend, you know, NYU's Clive Davis Institute, which is a really wonderful, you know, small school and recording program. And when I first got there, it was really this moment of like, you know, I grew up in a small town, and in that small town, I was kind of known as the music kid. But going to the big city and kind of being surrounded with all these incredible, talented people for the first time.
A bigger pond, really, as it were.
Yeah, exactly. So that first year was really this kind of realization of, okay, maybe I'm not the best artist or singer or songwriter in the world, but what I could do that nobody else could do was make really great sounding records. And right so I was always really into technology. And so that was really the beginning of my transition from singer-songwriter to engineer. And along the way, you know, when I was at school, I was lucky enough to study with some really incredible mixers and producers and engineers, Bob Power, Jim Anderson, who's a really great jazz engineer, mm-hmm. Kevin Killen, just some really incredible people who were gracious enough to share their knowledge with me. And so, you know, when I got out of school and started my mixing career, the original inspiration behind starting Behind the Speakers was to share some of that, you know, to share some of the knowledge and the experience that I gained from this amazing education and my kind of brief journey as a professional engineer with some people who maybe didn't have that same opportunity. So this was kind of a relatively new step for me. Behind the Speakers is about 1.5 years old now, but the reaction has just been incredible. And it's just given me this amazing opportunity to connect with so many incredibly talented people from all over the world. So I'm still learning and I'm still growing, as we all are, but, you know, I'm lucky to be where I am today.
Right on. And I love that you mentioned that you're still learning. I mean, that's something that I think, especially, you know, folks who might just be starting out or people who are, you know, at a point of frustration, they're not happy with their results. You know, we are all still learning. And if you're doing it right, you should try to be learning something every day, you know, no matter what it is. It is a lifelong pursuit, recording, mixing music, doing all these kinds of things, producing.
100%.
And so, yeah, no, I love that.
You know, one of my big kind of realizations, you know, back in college was one of my mentors, Bob Power, who, you know, is in his 60s now. He's an incredible mixing engineer. He's been mixing most of his life. And he, you know, took me aside one day and said, Jason, you know, my mixes have improved more in the last 5 or 10 years than they have in my entire life. And this is a guy who's been, you know, mixing for decades.
Exactly.
So if he can say that, I think we all can too. And you know, I agree. There really is never a point of arrival. It's kind of just always looking for that next step.
Absolutely. So on this show, I really wanted to, or this episode rather, I really wanted to talk about compression. which I know is something a lot of people struggle with. And it really doesn't matter what your skill level is or how long you've been doing it. At some point you may have some frustration with compression, and there's no shame in that.
Sure.
And so kind of to start us off, I know some people struggle with just really, I guess, understanding what compression is. And so I'm wondering, how would you describe or define compression to someone who's maybe newer to all of this, or might be, I don't know, thinking about it in not the best way, or maybe looking for a new way to think about it?
Got it. So if you're struggling with compression, you're definitely not alone. I think that for many mixers and producers and engineers, like Scott was saying, I think it's probably one of the most challenging parts or tools in the mixing process. Mm-hmm. But really, to break it down, compression is nothing more than an automatic volume knob. So in the same way that you grab a fader and turn that fader up and down to make a track louder or softer, a compressor is basically just turning down the level of a sound. And it can do that in a lot of different ways, and that can lead to a lot of different results. But really, all that compression is doing is basically turning things down when they exceed the threshold, which is a control that you set on the compressor. So
right.
where that gets kind of confusing is that there are so many different things that you can do with that, and so many effects that can create. But really, simply, it's nothing more than a kind of glorified volume knob, really.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So now one of the first things, maybe people kind of figure out, oh, this is what compression's all about. Then the next thing they might hear, and I know I kind of shout about this a lot, is, you want to not over compress things. You don't want to squash the life out of your mix and do that, unless you're going for a specific effect. Of course, there are types of music where you might want that. But so my question to you is, do you have any advice or rules or techniques to help people avoid over compressing and having kind of an amateur over compressed, squashed sound?
Sure. So a couple things I'll say on this. The first is that in general, when it comes to anything that you do in the mixing process, I think where people get into trouble is that they don't really have an intention or a reason behind the decisions that they make. So whenever we're adding plugins or processing to tracks for no reason, based on something that we read online, or because we think we should be proactive and compress something, not based on the sound that's coming out of the speakers, but based on some other reason, that's when people really get into trouble. So the first thing that I would say is that you really got to know why you're using it. You got to have a goal that you're aiming for. And if you're just grabbing compression and throwing it on different tracks for no reason, I think that's when you get into trouble. So that's number one. So, if you have an intention and if you have a reason for what you're doing, then I don't think there are any rules or kind of hard and fast guidelines. Like you were saying before, I mean, there are certain genres where heavy compression is kind of a hallmark part of that sound. And there are other genres and sounds where you might want to be more subtle. So I think it really goes back to having an intention and a reason behind the decisions that you're making. And that goes for anything you do in the mixing process. But so let's say, you've kind of got that down. Specifically on overcompression, I think that one of the challenges or one of the struggles that people run into is they try to get that kind of massive, larger than life sound at one point in the process. So people think they want a mix that sounds really loud, so they'll just add a ton of limiting and compression to their mix bus. And so the way I describe this is if you want to create a mix that sounds larger than life and has impact and sounds, impactful, but it doesn't sound kind of lifeless and over compressed, you got to approach it in stages. So it's like if you think of like a painter painting a wall, like the best painters don't just do it all in one coat, right? They'll apply.
They don't just throw it all on there.
Exactly. There's a base coat, the primer, and then they'll do multiple. So the way that I think about it is kind of in stages. So you might apply some compression on individual tracks, and then you might apply some compression on group buses, like maybe all your drums you compress together. And then, you have some compression on the mix bus, but in each of those places, you're maybe just compressing a little bit, but together you're getting a kind of larger than life, so to speak, sound, but it's not sounding super over compressed. So that's kind of philosophically how I would go about it. And the last thing I would say on this is you want to watch your attack time. I think that one of the main things that really makes things sound kind of lifeless and when you're dealing with compression is when you have an attack time that's too fast, because you end up removing or taking away a lot of the initial punch and the impact of notes if your attack time is too fast. So that can make things sound really flat and lifeless. So you really just want to pay attention to that attack time and make sure you're not so fast that you're shaving off a lot of that initial impact and transient of the notes themselves.
For sure. And I love too the kind of way you're describing about sort of building something. It's like, you're building something, brick by brick. It is not this kind of thing where, okay, I'm at this stage and now I'm just going to try to do everything to get it as loud as possible. It's like, well, you should have been doing that, kind of the whole time you're sort of building that energy or what have you.
Totally. And I think people get into this trap too with mastering where they feel like, that loudness happens in mastering. And so they have to do a ton in the mastering process to really make a mix sound loud. But the truth is that mixes that sound loud are kind of built in the mixing stage and really in the arrangement stage. So it happens in these stages. It doesn't happen all at once.
For sure. And kind of tied to that, I always had the philosophy of, if you're mixing, you should really be working to make your mastering engineer have the easiest job in the world. If I were to say it that way, like they just go and it's like, oh, all right, this is good. Maybe they'll play with a couple things, but then that's it. And to really approach that, one time I was asked, they're like, you recommend using reference tracks. And it's like, how does that help me if I'm using a reference track that's, been mastered and all this stuff? How does that help my mix? And I'm like, well, that gives you a target and you should go for that target in the mixing phase. It doesn't necessarily mean that just because you're not going to have it mastered that a reference track is useless to you.
I agree 100%. And the thing is, if you're dealing with clients and a lot of my audiences are, they're music makers, they're mixing their own music, but some of my audience is also people who are mixing for other clients, and that's where I come from. And if you're dealing with clients, they want to hear it sound like a record from square one. So if you send a mix to them and it's the excuse like, oh, it'll sound great in mastering.
That's not going to fly.
It's totally. So you got to make it sound great from, your first mix. It really has to sound like a record.
Absolutely. Okay, so if you could give only one tip, your best or your favorite about compression, what's your best or favorite compression tip to help someone, maybe get a better result?
Well, my best or favorite tip would probably be along the lines, of kind of what we had spoke about. And I'm not, trying to make this a cop out, but really that foundational thing of knowing what you're going for. And just to make it really actionable, the way I like to think about it is mixing is a responsive process, right? So it's this kind of feedback loop of listening to the sound that's coming out of the speakers, noticing that there's a problem or something that we don't like, and then figuring out, okay, how do we solve that? And then applying that solution and figuring out if that fixed the problem. And then you do that again and again and again and again until there are no problems left to solve, and then your mix is done. So really the key here is that, when it comes to compression or anything else, the best tip that I can give anyone is that make sure every decision you're making is a response to the sound that's coming out of the speakers. So whether, what compressor you grab, whether or not you grab a compressor at all, what the settings are, the truth is you gotta listen and make those judgments and decisions based on what's coming out of the speakers. And it sounds obvious, but the reason why I want to hark on this is because we all slip into these modes. I do it, where either we're tired or we're just, we're thinking, oh, we'll just like be proactive and add a compressor to that vocal from square one without there being a reason for it. And so there have been records that I put out that don't have any compression on the vocals. And then there have been records that are hyper compressed, with the vocals. And so the truth is all this stuff varies, but the one thing that'll always guide you in the right direction is really remaining in that responsive place where you're responding to what's coming out of the speakers.
No, I love that. I mean, that makes total sense. And yeah, I mean, it's the idea of, we talk about these tips and techniques and things like that, but, I always have the caveat, you got to listen to the song, and what you did this one time may not work on another time. And that's really kind of ties into what you're saying is, you need to respond to what the mix is telling you, or what problem you're hearing, or what it is about what you're doing that you're too far away from where you want to be, and how you can get closer to that.
Well, and that's where I think people get into trouble, especially people who are just starting out, where, they want that answer of, what should my attack time be on a compressor, or what should, what's the right ratio for vocals. And so we get in these zones where we want those easy, quick answers because that's what we think we need. Mm-hmm. But the truth is, it really comes back to really understanding the fundamentals of what these tools are doing, and then having a goal, having a sound that you're trying to achieve, and then twisting the knobs until you get there. And so you're being guided by the goal that you're going for versus some thing that you read on some forum online about how you should always use a 4-to-1 ratio on vocals.
Yeah. So now it's kind of funny. We've been discussing this because now I've got a question that might seem like I'm trying to get that out of you. But what advice, or maybe a technique, would you have for compressing vocals and getting great results? And, keep in mind, I understand there's no specific settings that are going to be perfect here.
So let's get we'll get actionable, because I don't want to kind of cop out on these answers. So I want to give you some practical stuff here.
For sure.
Or actionable, so to speak. So two things I have here. The first is, a lot of people don't think about this, but you can actually use your volume knob as a tool to help you zero in on different areas or frequencies in your mix. So, not to get into the whole geeky science behind it, but there are these curves called the Fletcher-Munson curves. And so basically these two guys, Harvey Fletcher and Wilden Munson, back in the 1930s, did all these tests. They played all these different tones for all these different people, and discovered that we don't hear the same at different volumes. So when we listen to things very loud, we hear more low end and high end. But when we turn things down and listen at quiet volumes, our ears are much more sensitive to mid-range. Yeah. So actionably, the way I like to think about this is that you can actually use your volume knob as kind of a magnifying glass to spotlight different areas of your mixes. So the vocals are most often really in the mid-range. That's where the heart and soul of the vocals lie. So when I'm mixing vocals and really zeroing in on the vocals, whether it's compression or automation or that stuff, I like to listen at really low levels, because it's almost like putting a magnifying glass up to that area, your mixes, and it just helps you make much more critical decisions about that area of your mixes. So the first advice I have is listen at very low levels. And when I say low levels, I mean, oftentimes it's like, someone like typing over it would be distracting. I mean, like really like quiet.
Yes.
And the next thing, I'll say on this is that I think people rely a little bit too much sometimes on compression to get that pro quality vocal sound. And the truth is, it's really compression in conjunction with automation that'll get you there. So even the best compressor in the world is not going to give you that sound where you hear every nuance on the vocal and everything just feels like it sits at a perfect level. So the way that I like to think about it is I try to get, 80 or 90% of the way there with compression, and then really go through the mix kind of 10 or 15 seconds at a time at very low levels, and ride up all the words and phrases and the tail ends of the notes, and try to get a lot of that detail and nuance out of the performance. And I think where people get stuck is they think that they can get that 100% with compression, and so they end up really slamming the vocals to try to get things to sit really consistent and even, and they get that, but the vocal sounds kind of lifeless. So I think you got to use both, and there's really no substitute for automation, but they're both important parts of the mixing process when it comes to vocals.
Absolutely. And riding the fader, as it were, is tried and true technique. So if you're using some automation and things like that, that makes perfect sense to me.
That's just what'll get you there. I mean, I would love to not spend 2 hours, riding a vocal, but, I do a lot of pop mixes and just to get that consistent sound where, you really hear every subtle detail. you got to do it. I mean, you got to get real granular. It's not particularly fun sometimes, but that's what it takes.
Absolutely, to get the great result. Sometimes mixing is about just grinding it out and really, putting in the time.
Yeah, and if there's any place you're really going to focus on it, it should be the vocal, I think so.
Absolutely, 100%. So, okay, a little different. We're not talking a vocal here, but what advice or maybe a technique would you have for compressing drums and getting, great results out of them?
So a couple things. First of all, you really have to watch your attack time with drums. And, because the impact in that front end of the transient of the drum hits, it's so important. It's so crucial to a great drum sound. If your attack times are too fast, you're just going to destroy that. And you're going to end up with a drum sound that sounds really flat and just lifeless. So in general, slower attack times with drums are going to retain and really bring out a lot of that punch and impact. Because again, what we're doing here is we're basically saying, to the compressor, let through some of that initial energy before the compressor turns down the signal. So the impact of that is that, again, that transient, the initial onset of, the sound when the stick hits the head, that kind of punch is really cutting through much more aggressively. And so we get much more punch and impact on the front end of the note. So slower attack times. Another thing that I've found really helpful is parallel compression, specifically, with acoustic drums. I find that parallel compression can be really helpful to add some density and some body to the drums so they kind of hold up in a track. So I'll just send like the entire drum mix through to a compressor and then just fade that in under the drums just to add some kind of weight and density. And I find that really helps just kind of give the drums that presence they need, especially in a busy track. So I would definitely recommend checking out parallel compression on drums. I think it can be, give you some great results.
Right on. So, okay, I'm curious. The overarching question is, what are your thoughts on mix bus compression? Do you find yourself using it often? And if you do you tend to add it earlier in the mixing process or later? Because I know there's a lot of debate and philosophies. I've seen some people say, oh, no, you would never want to add it at this point, or you would never want to add it so late, or whatever it is. So I'm always just curious what other mixers might do.
So here are my thoughts. On mix bus compression, I tend to use it more often than not, maybe 75% of the time. I don't use it 100% of the time. And so it's not kind of enabled from square one. But I do try to add it as early as possible in the process. Right. And they're philosophically, the reason why I think that's a better approach is because whenever you add something, if you think about it, whenever you add something to your mix bus, the changes that you're making affect every single track in your mix, right? So if you spend 12 hours making your mix sound absolutely perfect and you have all the balances, everything's dialed in, and then you add a compressor right at the end of the line, which is what a lot of people do, and start making changes, you're gonna change and alter the fundamental balance of your mix. And I think this can be a really dangerous thing. And oftentimes people don't even realize because their ears are already kind of burned down and they've kind of lost their objectivity at this point. So it's really easy to screw something up at the end of the line by adding mix bus compression too late. I mean, there are some people that do it and do it with great results. But for me, I found adding it earlier, the benefit is that all of your decisions throughout the mixing process are shaped by what that mix bus processing is doing. So it ends up becoming a part of your mix and it influences all your decisions. And you don't have to worry about adding something too late in the line and messing up the kind of fundamental balances of your mix. The other reason why I think it's great to add early on is I really enjoy mixing into mix bus compression because it's almost like mixing into like a sheet of what's the stuff, like the stuff that you cover pots with in the cling wrap or something like that. Yeah. Where it kind of gives back a little bit, like it's a little stretchy. Like
I see what you're saying.
It kind of counteracts your moves. Like, so if you turn up a vocal a little bit too much, the mix bus compressor kind of turns it down a little bit. And so it's like there's this kind of play going on between your moves and the mix bus compressor. And I think you can be a little bit more bold and aggressive with some of your fader rides and some of your moves because you have that kind of reining in your decisions. So I just think it's more fun. I think mixes come together much more easily and much more quickly. So I like mixing into it and definitely, kind of avoiding adding it at the end. For me, I think it minimizes the chance that I screw something up, which is half the job sometimes, just not making it worse.
For sure.
So, but that being said, I mean, there are great mixers that I know, some of my mentors who added mix bus compression, right at the end and whose mixes sound amazing. So I think you can certainly do it both ways. You just have to be very careful if you're adding it at the end of the line.
I like that. No, that's a really good sort of philosophy to have on that. So now I'm curious, and maybe it's different with everything you're doing, or it should be, but do you have a process for dialing in a compressor? Is it just, hey, I'm twisting knobs until I like how it sounds? Or do you have I have a general strategy that I follow?
Sure. So a couple of things here. I think first, it really all goes back to the step one is determining, okay, what am I trying to do with this compressor?
Right. What's my goal? Yeah.
And then that is so important because, again, I think what people struggle with compression is there's so many things you can do with it. And so setting the attack time to fast and the release time to slow is going to give you a completely different sound than the opposite. And, there are a million different things you can do. So first you got to figure out what you're trying to do. So, for me, that is listening to the mix and hearing some sort of problem and saying, okay, maybe the vocal sounds like it's, kind of coming in and out and it's not very solid. It doesn't sit consistently in the mix. And so when I pull up that compressor, I'm already going in my head, okay, the goal is to make that vocal sit solid and evenly in the mix. And so that informs how I kind of approach setting the parameters and tweaking the different controls on the compressor. So given, kind of what I'm trying to do, I kind of in my head have an idea of what the settings might be. So for example, if I'm trying to add punch to something, I know I'm going to have a slow attack time because I want that initial transient to come through the compressor. And so that compressor is going to kind of retain that punch and bring out that impact on the track or whatever it is that I'm compressing.
For sure.
Sometimes I might be using a compressor to shave off some of that transient. Maybe something's poking out of the mix and is just sounding like too plucky and aggressive.
Bring that in.
Yeah, and so I might use a fast attack time. So again, kind of determining what the goal is step one. And then for me, I have another way that I think about the mixing process as a whole, but it really applies to using compression or any plugin in the mixing process. And it's a concept called concentric circles. And this is something that one of my mentors, Bob Power, taught me. Basically, the way he describes it is mixing is this series of circles. So you start really broad and you make these really gross kind of big moves. Mm-hmm. And then as you move through the process, you kind of narrow in and make finer and finer adjustments. And so that's kind of the way that I go about applying compression. So I'll start, really kind of spinning the knobs, kind of not really fine detailing. I'll go really broad when I'm starting out. And then kind of as I'm dialing in a sound and I'm starting to get the results that I'm looking for, that's when I'm kind of narrowing in on those finer moves and kind of making decisions that are a little bit more fine.
So do you walk it back almost? Do you do okay, I'm gonna make a larger move here that's kind of more wide sweeping, and then I might dial it back to kind of try to fine tune it? Yeah.
So oftentimes, like you mentioned, it's like going overboard. And being because if I'm trying to figure out, for example, what the right attack time is or release time, I think the best way to do that is to add too much compression. And then those decisions and those changes on those knobs become much easier to hear. And so again, going really bold at the beginning and then kind of backing up from there and dialing in with a little bit more nuance. And the last thing I'll say on this, is that you want to really try to make the majority of your decisions in context with the rest of the mix playing. Mm-hmm. I mean, this goes for EQ or compression or really anything. Our job when we're mixing is to try to make a group of tracks sound good together as a unit. And so nobody cares what the vocal sounds like in solo, or the kick
Because they're not going to listen to it in solo.
Right. And so the problem when you solo something is you lose that context, right? You're listening to something on its own, and so you have no idea what the right decisions are to make. So like oftentimes on vocals, you have to compress them a lot more than you probably would if you soloed it. So unsoloing things and really listening to them in context with the mix is going to help you make the right compression decisions. And that really applies to any tool that you might use in the mixing process.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I kind of always mention that there is a time to solo, and I don't kind of subscribe to the idea. There's some people that say you should never solo. I think that's too broad. But I think you're 100% correct in that it's like you've got to mix with context. You've got to keep in mind that you're creating something, you're trying to make all the tracks work together.
Yeah, 100%.
And that's so crucial. And it makes sense to me that, you know, if you're compressing something, that seeing how that works with the rest of the mix is a good idea and will ultimately net you greater results than you would if you were just like, well, now I'm going to solo this and just focus on compressing this solo. It's like, well, but what are you doing? You know, how's this going to fit with everything else?
Right. And I really that's something I really try to kind of hammer in on my blog and through my courses and things like that is really trying to get people to think about their decisions in a broader context, right? I mean, we tend to be very granular when we think about mixing. Like you go to Google and you type in like how to EQ, and like the thing that autofills is like vocals or like, you know, people think about tracks in this kind of siloed way. But the truth is every decision in the mixing process affects everything else. So you add too much compression to a vocal and suddenly, you know, the rest of your tracks are going to sound undercompressed because they have too much dynamics compared to the vocals. So it's this process where you got to consider everything as kind of a unit. And I think the more you can do that, the better your mixes ultimately are going to sound.
For sure. So we couldn't talk compression without talking about multiband compression, I think.
Yes, the infamous.
It is so powerful because of, in my opinion, the added control it gives you over your mix. For those who don't know, you know, that's being able to compress specific frequency bands. It's really like multiple compressors in one. And this obviously, again, gives you a bunch of other options and can get you some great results. But my question for you, Jason, is, you know, what advice or maybe a cool technique or something like that would you have for using multiband compression to get some great results in your mix?
Sure. So to start, I think multiband compression is way overhyped.
Okay.
And look, there are some people who swear by it, and for some people, it's a crucial part of their mixing process.
Yeah.
For me, I think of it as a problem-solving tool, and I think people overuse it, and I think there are some serious drawbacks to multiband compression. With that being said, I think that it can be a fantastic tool in a very kind of specific set of circumstances. And the way that I think about multiband compression is when I have a track where let's say you have a vocal, for example, and you know, the vocalist is singing and she didn't, you know, when she was recording the performance, maybe she didn't have great mic technique. So there are certain words where she came really close to the mic and you know, there was kind of a boominess, right? And then other parts where she kind of came away from the mic and it sounds kind of thin.
Right.
Ultimately, you know, you can try to fix that with EQ, but it's always going to be a compromise, right? So if you add low end to those thin parts to kind of bolster them up, then the thick parts where she's really close to the mic are going to sound boomy and muddy. Whereas, you know, if you try to cut out the low end on those parts that sound boomy and muddy, you know, the thin parts are going to sound even thinner. So you're left with this kind of juggling act of, you know, what do I do? How do I address this? So the way that I think about multiband compression is it's a tool that you can use to solve those sorts of problems. So when I have a track that's tonally inconsistent and I want to kind of even it out, so I want the parts, like in that example, I want the parts that sound too thin to have a little bit more low end, and I want the parts that sound too thick to have less low end.
Yeah.
That's where you can use multiband compression to kind of zero in on that area and just even it out a little bit. So really controlling the dynamics of a certain part of the frequency spectrum. But going back to the downsides of multiband compression, splitting a track up into multiple different frequency bands and processing them independently can create phase artifacts. And some of the newer plugins are better at addressing those things. And there aren't as many of the problems that you saw on some of the earlier multiband compressors. But I still try to avoid it. And really, it's only a tool I use maybe on 1 out of 10 mixes. So that's how I approach multiband compression. And I know other people, like to use it maybe more frequently, but for me, it's really a problem-solving tool.
Right on. No, I mean, I think that makes sense the way you kind of think about it. And, like anything in audio, if there's someone out there who loves using multiband compression, don't let us, destroy your confidence in using that tool.
Absolutely. And look, I mean, this goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, right? There really is. First of all, I'm still learning. So, my opinion might change 2 years or 3 years down the line.
Exactly,
I might love multiband compression and be using it on everything. But furthermore, I mean, there really is no right or wrong way to go about any of this stuff. And so you got to find the techniques and the tactics that work for you. And if your records sound great, then at the end of the day, how you get there is not super relevant to me.
Right on. Jason, I wanted to thank you so much for coming on the show today and really sharing your expertise and your thoughts on compression.
Absolutely. It's an honor to be here, and I really appreciate what you're doing too. I think, what you're giving back to the audio community is fantastic. So thank you for what you do.
Oh, for sure. For sure. So, I wanted to thank everyone for listening. If you'd like to learn more from Jason, you can check out behindthespeakers.com. And actually, if you're interested, Jason was kind enough to put together a compression cheat sheet, which has some tips and tricks, some compression mistakes that you don't know you're making, 9 of them, some of his favorite plugins. And you can actually get that being an Audio Skills podcast listener. Go to behindthespeakers.com/Scott. And you can check that out. Again, thank you so much for listening today. And as a reminder, for links and information about today's show and our guest, please check out our show notes at audioskills.com/podcast. No matter what you're doing, no matter what your skill level is, what type of music you're making, keep working at it, keep improving, keep learning, and no matter what, just go out there and make some great music.
Ready to go even deeper with your recording, mixing, and music production? We've got all the info and techniques you need in one place so you can turn it up. Go to audioskills.com and access a huge library of video tutorials and private workshops so you make progress even faster. Come back next week for a brand new episode of the Audio Skills Podcast.